In 507, a king who could not read or write defeated another king who had compiled an entire sophisticated code of Roman law. The man who would later murder all his relatives to consolidate power was celebrated as the great defender of the one true Catholic faith. The king, who allowed Catholic councils in his own kingdom, was branded a dangerous heretic who needed to be utterly destroyed once and for all. This battle, the Battle of Vouillé, would reshape Europe's map and determine the fate of an entire continent for many centuries to come. Most importantly, it would give birth to a nation that still exists today, a nation we call France, forever the homeland of the Franks. This is the story of how France was born, a tale that most history books around the world have somehow completely forgotten to tell us. But before we get to this decisive battle, we need to travel back to Europe in the 5th century after the birth of Jesus Christ, to understand why these two kingdoms were destined to clash in mortal combat, and why one had to die for France to rise from the ashes. In 476, the mighty Western Roman Empire finally collapsed after nearly 1,000 years of total domination over all Europe. Europe descended into chaos, and Germanic tribes from the frozen north swept down to seize whatever remained of the once great civilization. The Visigoths, one of the most powerful Germanic tribes, established a kingdom with a magnificent capital at the city of Toulouse. On December 28, 484, Alaric II became king of the Visigoths right after his father had passed away. Here is the first surprise. This barbarian king commissioned the Breviarium Alaricianum, an incredibly sophisticated code of Roman law. He was not the savage people imagined. He preserved Roman civilization and permitted complete religious freedom throughout his realm. In 506, Alaric let 35 Catholic bishops hold a council at Agde, even though he himself followed the Arian Christian faith. The problem was that Arianism and Catholicism, though both worshipping Christ, believed fundamentally different things about his nature. To the Catholics of that time, Arianism was dangerous heresy, and any ruler who followed the Arian faith was an enemy to be destroyed. Now let us look to northern Gaul, where another Germanic tribe was quietly rising to power, the Franks, under their young king Clovis. In 481, Clovis became king at just 15 years old, inheriting a small kingdom centered around the town of Tournai. This boy could neither read nor write a single word. Yet he possessed an extraordinarily rare talent for military strategy and politics. In 486, Clovis defeated Syagrius, the last Roman general still holding out in Gaul, at the famous Battle of Soissons. Syagrius fled to Toulouse seeking protection from Alaric, but the Visigothic king handed him over to Clovis to avoid conflict. This was the first contact between the Frankish and Visigothic kingdoms, and at first everything seemed to go quite smoothly. But there was a much deeper problem that no amount of diplomacy could ever solve. A problem rooted in the very nature of religion. Visigoths followed Arianism, Ostrogoths followed Arianism, Vandals followed Arianism, almost all Germanic kingdoms followed Arianism. But the Franks were completely different. They were still pagans who had never converted to Christianity in any form whatsoever. As for the Gallo-Romans, subjects of Roman descent living in these Germanic kingdoms, they faithfully followed Roman Catholicism. They absolutely hated being ruled by Arian kings, and they eagerly waited for a savior to liberate them from the heretical rulers. This was a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity for Clovis. If he converted to Catholicism, he would have something no other king had. So we must ask, what made a pagan king like Clovis decide to completely abandon the ancient gods of his own ancestors forever? The answer lies with one remarkable woman, Princess Clotilde of Burgundy, who would later become the beloved wife of King Clovis. Around 493, Clovis married Clotilde, and she immediately began her patient campaign to convert her husband to the faith. Their firstborn child was baptized according to Catholic rites, but the baby died tragically just a few short days after the ceremony. Clovis blamed Catholicism entirely, declaring that if the child had been offered to his own gods, the boy would not have died. Their second child was also baptized Catholic, and also fell gravely ill immediately afterward, seeming destined to follow his brother. But Clotilde refused to give up. She prayed day and night without stopping, and miraculously, the child recovered completely healthy. Then the decisive turning point arrived, traditionally dated to 496, though recent research now suggests a different year. During a desperate battle against the Alemanni at Tolbiac, the Frankish army was pushed to the very brink of total defeat and ruin. Gregory of Tours tells us that in battle, Clovis looked up to heaven and prayed to Clotilde's god, begging for victory that day. The Alemanni suddenly broke and fled in disorder. Their king fell dead on the battlefield, and the Franks won a decisive victory. Clovis kept his promise to God. He was baptized by Bishop Remigius at Reims, along with 3,000 of his loyal Frankish warriors. In just one single night, Clovis became the only Catholic king in all Western Europe, welcomed by the Church as a new Constantine. Now he finally had a legitimate reason to attack Alaric, not for greed of land, but to liberate his fellow Catholics from heresy. The Gallo-Roman Catholics living in the Visigothic kingdom now looked toward Clovis as the liberator they had long been waiting for. In 502, Clovis and Alaric met on a small island in the Loire River to sign a temporary peace treaty between their kingdoms. The two kings dined together, exchanged gifts, and swore not to make war, but both knew deep down that this peace would not last. Theodoric the Great, the Ostrogothic king ruling Italy and father-in-law of Alaric, tried desperately to mediate between the two. He sent urgent letters to both sides, urging them to keep peace, warning that war would only weaken all the Germanic kingdoms. But Theodoric failed to understand that this was no longer about territory. This was a war framed in the language of holy faith. In 506, Alaric issued his breviary and convened the Council of Agda, desperately trying to appease his Catholic subjects. But it was far too late. Clovis already had his reasons, his widespread support, and enough troops to act when spring finally came. Finally, in the spring of 507, Clovis assembled his entire Frankish army and began his great campaign toward the south. The Frankish forces crossed the Loire River, the ancient boundary between the kingdoms, and pushed deep into wealthy Visigothic lands. The Burgundians under King Gundobad, an ally of Clovis, also sent forces from the east to open a second front in the campaign. Alaric now faced the hardest decision of his life, to fight head-on or retreat and wait for reinforcements from King Theodoric. The proud Visigothic nobles refused to flee before the enemy. They pressured Alaric relentlessly until he agreed to face Clovis. Theodoric had promised to send elite Ostrogothic troops from Italy to help, but they were busy fighting the Byzantines back east. Alaric had no other choice. He gathered his entire Visigothic army and marched north to block the advancing Frankish forces. The location chosen for this decisive battle was Vouillé, an open plain about 15 kilometers northwest of the city of Poitiers. In spring 507, two massive armies stood facing each other across that field, and the fate of Europe hung in the balance. No one knows exactly how many soldiers each side had, but both had mobilized forces far larger than usual for a military campaign. The Franks had Ripuarian reinforcements from the Rhine, while the Visigoths had loyal Auvergne militia from central Gaul with them. Gregory of Tours says the Visigoths fought at range with javelins, while the Franks charged straight in for brutal hand-to-hand combat. The Franks were famous for the Francisca, a deadly throwing axe that could pierce shields and completely shatter enemy formations. The battle raged with incredible fury, both sides fighting desperately for every inch of ground, neither willing to give any way. Then something no one expected happened. Clovis himself charged straight into the heart of battle, personally seeking King Alaric. Two Visigothic horsemen spotted the Frankish king and charged at him from both sides, their spears thrusting straight at his body. Clovis nearly died right there. Only his thick armor and his fast warhorse saved him from certain death in that deadly ambush attack. If his armor had been just centimeters thinner, if his horse had been one step slower, there would be no France as we know it today. But Clovis survived, and the Visigothic army began to break when soldiers saw their King Alaric fleeing from the bloody battlefield. Alaric desperately tried to retreat from the chaos, but he could not escape. The Franks caught up with him and surrounded the king. According to Gregory of Tours, Clovis personally killed Alaric with his own hands, though this detail cannot be confirmed for certain. But whoever killed Alaric no longer mattered. What mattered was that the Visigothic kingdom in Gaul had completely and utterly fallen. A mighty kingdom that stood for nearly a century, with its magnificent capital at Toulouse, ended completely in just one afternoon. The Auvergne nobility, Gallo-Romans who had fought bravely on Alaric's side, were almost entirely wiped out on that bloody battlefield. Amalaric, the only legitimate son of Alaric, was only about 5 years old at the time. He was quickly evacuated south to Narbonne. Gessalec, the illegitimate son of Alaric, was elected new king by surviving nobles, but the kingdom was now nothing more than ruins. The Battle of Vouillé was over. Alaric was dead. The Visigoths had lost. But the consequences of this battle were only beginning. After his great victory, Clovis led his army down to Toulouse and seized the entire Visigothic royal treasury built over a century. He went on to capture Bordeaux and Angoulême and nearly all of fertile Aquitaine, the wealthiest lands the Visigoths had possessed. In 508, Byzantine Emperor Anastasius I sent envoys to bestow upon Clovis the honorary Roman title of consul. A king from a barbarian tribe was now recognized by the Eastern Roman Empire as if he were the legitimate heir of Rome itself. Also in 508, Theodoric finally sent elite Ostrogothic troops to intervene in the conflict, but by then it was too late. The Ostrogoths only saved Narbonne and tiny Septimania for young Amalaric. The rest of the territory was lost forever to Clovis. The Visigoths were forced to withdraw to the Iberian Peninsula, establishing a new capital at Toledo, ruling Spain 2 more centuries. As for Clovis, he did not stop at Vouillé. After defeating his external enemies, he turned to deal with his internal rivals next. This is the part textbooks prefer to ignore, because this so-called defender of the faith was actually a cold-blooded murderer. Clovis assassinated Sigebert, king of the Ripuarian Franks, Chararic, king of the Franks of Terouanne, and many other relatives too. Ragnachar, one of his own cousins, who had once fought loyally beside him in battle, was murdered along with his 2 younger brothers. Gregory of Tours says Clovis once lamented being like a lonely traveller among strangers, with no relatives left to turn to anymore. But Gregory also adds that Clovis said this only to lure any surviving relatives out of hiding, so he could then have them killed. In 511, just 5 years after his victory at Vouillé, Clovis died in the city of Paris, at only 45 years of age. He never saw his dream of unification become reality. His kingdom was divided among his 4 sons, according to Frankish tradition, but the legacy he left would endure forever. The land once called Gaul now bore the name Francia, and from Francia would come France. The Visigoths left their mark on the Iberian Peninsula until the Muslims conquered the entire region in the year 711. The Catholic Church got exactly what it wanted, a powerful Catholic kingdom at the heart of Western Europe to protect the faith. Charles de Gaulle, the legendary French president of the 20th century, once declared that the history of France begins with Clovis. The Battle of Vouillé in 507 was that decisive moment, the moment when ancient Gaul died and modern France was born. A 15-year-old boy who could not read, in just 30 years, transformed a small tribe into an empire dominating all of Europe. That is the story of Vouillé in 507, the day France was born from the blood and tears of 2 great barbarian kingdoms.